Imagine you're riding the bus on a regular afternoon, just minding your own business. You look around and see the usual crowd, people of all different backgrounds, ages, and walks of life. It's a scene that plays out in cities all over the world every single day. But today, something different is about to happen. Something that will leave everyone on that bus in shock. There's a man sitting quietly in the back, a black man in his late 30s, wearing a simple hoodie and listening to music through his headphones. He looks calm, maybe even a little tired from a long day. He's not bothering anyone, just trying to get home like the rest of the passengers. But little does he know, he's about to become the target of someone's cruel, unexpected outburst. A few rows ahead of him, a middle-aged woman starts to shift in her seat. She's been staring at the man for a while now, her eyes narrowing as if something about him is bothering her. Her face twists into a frown, and it's clear she's about to say something. The bus is relatively quiet, the low hum of the engine filling the space, but soon her voice cuts through the air. At first, it's just a murmur, something about people like him and how they don't belong. Passengers around her glance nervously at each other, sensing the tension, but unsure of what's going to happen next. The woman's voice grows louder, and before anyone can react, she turns around in her seat, glaring at the man in the back. "People like you are the problem," she snaps, her voice full of venom. "This country would be better off without you." The entire bus falls silent. Heads turn as passengers try to make sense of what they've just heard. Some are too stunned to speak, while others shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of whether they should intervene or stay out of it. The air feels thick, the tension almost unbearable. Everyone's waiting to see how the man will respond. But to their surprise, he doesn't react immediately. He takes a deep breath, removes his headphones, and looks at the woman with a calm, measured gaze. There's a quiet strength in his expression, as if this isn't the first time he's had to deal with something like this. But before he can say a word, the woman continues her rant, oblivious to the growing discomfort of everyone around her. "You people come here and ruin everything," she hisses, her voice dripping with prejudice. "I don't know why they let people like you in. You don't belong here." By now, the mood on the bus has shifted entirely. You can feel the unease hanging in the air, like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for someone to step in. But here's the thing, the woman has no idea what's coming, because just a few rows behind her, someone has been listening to every word she said. And that person is about to change everything. Without her knowing, a man in a business suit, sitting quietly near the front of the bus, rises from his seat. He's been watching the whole scene unfold, and now he's had enough. Slowly he begins to walk toward the woman, his expression unreadable. Other passengers notice him moving and start to whisper among themselves, wondering what he's going to do. As he approaches the woman, there's a strange shift in the atmosphere. The tension doesn't fade, but it changes, like something big is about to happen. The racist woman, still unaware of the man coming up behind her, continues her tirade, her words growing uglier by the second. But now, she's not just targeting the man in the back, she's ranting about entire communities, throwing insults and stereotypes around without a care. But the man in the suit says nothing. He stands just behind her, watching, waiting for the right moment. And then, finally, he speaks. "Excuse me," he says, his voice calm but firm. The woman stops mid-sentence, startled. She turns around to see who's speaking, her face immediately shifting from anger to confusion. She wasn't expecting this. And when she sees who it is, this tall, well-dressed man, with a serious look on his face, she doesn't know how to react. The bus is dead silent now. Everyone's eyes are on the two of them. The black man in the back watches, his expression unreadable. The woman, caught off guard, stammers for a moment, clearly unsure of what's about to happen. "Is there a problem here?" The man in the suit asks, his tone still calm, but with a weight behind it that makes the woman falter. She opens her mouth to respond, but nothing comes out. The woman stood there, stunned, staring at the man who had interrupted her. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she was going to say something, but she quickly clamped it shut, unsure of what to do. The man in the suit didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact, and in that moment, the entire bus seemed frozen in time. The other passengers were watching with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. No one had expected this. The tension had been building, but now it had shifted in a way that no one could predict. The woman, who had been so confident just moments before, now looked small and unsure of herself. She glanced around nervously, clearly realizing that the attention was no longer on the man she had insulted, but on her. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider doubling down, to keep going with her hateful rant. But something about the man standing in front of her, the calm authority in his voice, made her hesitate. She looked up at him again, and her eyes flickered with recognition, like she finally understood that this wasn't just an ordinary situation anymore. Something was different now, something bigger than she could grasp. The man in the suit didn't raise his voice, didn't show any sign of anger. Instead, he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "It seems like you have a lot to say," he said, still standing just a few feet away from her. "But maybe now's the time to stop and think about the impact of your words." The woman blinked rapidly, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. She clearly didn't like being called out, especially in front of so many people. But there was something about this man that made it impossible for her to lash out the way she had before. He wasn't just anyone. She could tell from his presence, the way he held himself, that there was something more to him. But she didn't know what. The passengers on the bus could feel the tension shifting again. It was as if they were all waiting for something to happen, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The black man, who had been the target of the woman's insults, sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't said a word since the woman had started her rant. He seemed calm, almost as if he had expected this kind of thing to happen. But there was something in his eyes now, something that suggested he knew more than anyone else on the bus. The woman fidgeted in her seat, her confidence visibly crumbling. She glanced back at the black man in the back of the bus, then at the man in the suit standing in front of her. She seemed to be searching for some way to get out of the situation she had created for herself, but there was no easy escape. "Who do you think you are?" she finally spat, her voice shaky. She was trying to regain control, to shift the power back in her favor, but it wasn't working. "You don't know anything about me, or what I've been through." The man in the suit didn't react to her outburst. He just stood there, his eyes steady, as if he had heard this kind of excuse 1,000 times before. "You're right," he said calmly. "I don't know your story. But I do know that what you said was wrong. And you need to understand that too." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She was trapped, caught between the truth of what he was saying and the shame of being called out in front of so many people. The other passengers were still watching, their faces a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction. For once, someone was standing up to people like her, and they could feel the shift in power happening right in front of them. The bus rumbled on through the city, the sound of the engine filling the silence that had settled over the passengers. Outside, life went on as usual, but inside the bus, it felt like something significant was unfolding, something that none of them would soon forget. The man in the suit still hadn't revealed much about himself, but there was something about him that made everyone on the bus sit up a little straighter, pay a little more attention. He wasn't just another commuter. There was something in his calm demeanor, in the way he spoke, that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. And woman, despite her initial bravado, seemed to sense that too. "I don't have to listen to this," she muttered under her breath, trying to regain some sense of control. She looked around the bus, hoping to find support from one of the other passengers, but no one met her gaze. Everyone had seen her behavior for what it was: ugly, unnecessary, and unprovoked. The man in the suit stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. "You're free to leave," he said quietly. "But before you do, maybe you should take a moment to think about what kind of person you want to be. What kind of legacy you want to leave behind." The woman's face reddened, and for a moment, it looked like she was going to lash out again. But then, something changed. Her shoulders slumped, and the fire in her eyes dimmed. She glanced one last time at the black man she had insulted, then at the man in the suit, and without another word, she gathered her things and hurried off the bus at next stop. The doors hissed shut behind her, and the bus lurched back into motion. A collective breath seemed to be released from the passengers as they processed what had just happened. The tension in the air began to dissolve, and the usual sounds of the city filtered back into the bus, filling the space that had been thick with conflict just moments before. The man in the suit turned and walked back to his seat near the front of the bus, his expression calm and unbothered, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the other passengers were still buzzing with energy. They exchanged glances, some even whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. As for the black man in the back, he remained quiet, his eyes focused on the window as the city streets passed by in a blur. He hadn't said a single word throughout the entire ordeal, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't surprised by any of it. It was as if he had seen this kind of thing before, more times than he could count. And yet, there was something else too, something unspoken that hung in the air between him and the man in the suit. It wasn't just a random act of kindness or a stranger stepping in to help. No, there was more to this story, more to these two men than met the eye. The passengers on the bus didn't know it yet, but they had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything. Because while the woman may have left the bus, the mystery of the man in the suit and the quiet strength of the man in the back was only just beginning to unravel. And soon, everyone would realize that this moment was just the tip of the iceberg. What they didn't know was that the man in the suit had his own story, his own reasons for stepping in. And the black man, who had remained silent through it all, had a history with him that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. But that's a story for another day. Because for now, the mystery remains: who was the man in the suit, and why did he care so much about a stranger on the bus? And more importantly, what connection did he have to the man in the back, the one who had been the target of the woman's hateful words? The answers to those questions would soon come to light, and when they did, it would change everything. But for now, the bus continued on its route, the passengers settling back into their seats, unaware of the twists and turns that were still to come. As the bus rumbled along its route, the tension slowly dissipating, the passengers began to settle back into their routines. Conversations resumed, though they were quieter, more cautious, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. But the man in the suit remained calm, almost eerily so, his gaze fixed on the cityscape outside the window. The black man in the back, still silent, watched him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he knew more about this stranger than anyone else on the bus. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted, but it wasn't just because the racist woman had left. There was something else, something lingering in the air that no one could quite put their finger on. The other passengers might have thought the conflict was over, but for the man in the back, it was only beginning. Suddenly, the bus jerked to a stop at a red light. The doors opened briefly, allowing the city sounds to flood in. That's when something unexpected happened. A tall, imposing figure boarded the bus, a man with a serious expression, his eyes scanning the crowd. His presence was immediately unsettling, and the other passengers noticed. He moved with purpose, his gaze zeroing in on the man in the suit. As the new man approached, the air in the bus seemed to thicken again. The calm that had settled after the earlier confrontation was gone, replaced with a sense of impending tension. The man in the suit didn't move, didn't even flinch, but there was something in the way his shoulders stiffened that indicated he knew this wasn't just a random encounter. The tall man stood in the aisle, looming over the seated passengers. He locked eyes with the man in the suit. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath. "You think you can just walk away from what you've done?" the new man asked, his voice low and threatening. There was no mistaking the malice in his tone. Whatever this was, it was personal. The man in the suit didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly turned his head to face the tall man, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. The other passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was about to happen. The black man in the back of the bus shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving the two men in the center of the conflict. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, as if he had seen this tall man before, or at least heard of him. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a random altercation. It went much deeper than that. Finally, the man in the suit spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though there was an edge to his words that suggested he knew exactly what this was about. The tall man took a step closer, his face now inches from the man in the suit. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly why I'm here." The entire bus had gone silent again, the passengers watching with a mix of fear and curiosity. They had already witnessed one confrontation today, and now it seemed like another one was about to unfold, but this one was different. This wasn't just about a racist outburst, it felt far more dangerous, far more personal. The man in the suit stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He wasn't a small man, but compared to the towering figure in front of him, he seemed almost dwarfed. Still, there was no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle the taller man. "You've been following me," the man in the suit said, his tone calm but accusing. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "Why?" The tall man smirked, but it was a cold, humorless smile. "You know why." The black man in the back of the bus leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. He had been content to stay out of the earlier confrontation, but this was different. He could sense that there was more to the man in the suit than met the eye, and now, with this new player in the mix, the stakes had just been raised. The tension between the two men reached a breaking point. The tall man lunged forward suddenly, grabbing the man in the suit by the collar. The other passengers gasped, some of them shrinking back in their seats, while others fumbled for their phones, unsure whether to record or call for help. But before the situation could escalate further, the black man from the back of the bus stood up. He moved quickly, stepping into the aisle with a quiet authority that immediately drew everyone's attention. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced with a look of determination and focus. "Let him go," the black man said, his voice steady but firm. There was no shouting, no bravado, just a quiet command that somehow carried more weight than the tall man's aggression. For a moment, the tall man hesitated, his grip on the man in the suit loosening slightly. He turned his head to look at the black man, clearly sizing him up. But something about the black man's presence seemed to give him pause. "You don't want to get involved in this," the tall man warned, though his voice lacked the same confidence it had earlier. The black man didn't flinch. "I'm already involved." The tall man released his grip on the man in the suit, but he didn't back down. Instead, he took a step toward the black man, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The black man met his gaze, unbothered by the threat. "Neither do you." For a moment, it seemed like the situation was about to spiral out of control. The tall man's fists clenched, his jaw tight with anger. But then, something changed. His eyes flickered with recognition, as if he suddenly realized who the black man was. He took a step back, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty. The tension in the bus hung heavy in the air, but the tall man seemed to be reconsidering his next move. He glanced at the man in the suit, then back at the black man, and for the first time since he had boarded the bus, he looked unsure of himself. The man in the suit, who had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, straightened his jacket and took a deep breath. "This isn't the place for this," he said quietly, though his voice carried a sense of finality. The tall man glared at him, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the bus, his presence still looming, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. The passengers, who had been holding their breath, slowly began to relax again, though the unease in the air remained. No one knew what had just happened, but it was clear that the confrontation wasn't over. It had simply been postponed. The black man sat back down, his expression calm once again, though his eyes remained focused on the tall man. The man in the suit, meanwhile, quietly took his seat, his face betraying no emotion. But there was something in the way he sat, something in the set of his jaw, that suggested this was far from over. As the bus continued its journey through the city, the passengers were left with more questions than answers. Who was the tall man, and why was he after the man in the suit? And what was the connection between the man in the suit and the black man who had stepped in to defuse the situation? The mystery was deepening, the stakes were rising, and whatever was happening on this bus was far from ordinary. The passengers could feel it in the air, the sense that something much bigger was at play, something that none of them could fully understand. But one thing was clear: the man in the suit, the black man, and the tall stranger were all connected in ways that went far beyond what anyone could see. And before this bus ride was over, that connection would be revealed, and it would change everything. As the bus continued on its path, the atmosphere remained thick with tension. No one could shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. The man in the suit, still composed but clearly on edge, kept glancing at the tall man in the back of the bus. Meanwhile, The black man sat quietly, his eyes tracking the movements of both men. It felt like a standoff, but no one knew when or how it would break. Suddenly, the bus took a sharp turn, jolting everyone in their seats. The driver hadn't announced the detour, and now the bus was heading down a quieter, more isolated street. The passengers exchanged worried looks, the uneasy feeling in the air growing stronger. The man in the suit stood up abruptly and made his way to the front of the bus. He leaned toward the driver, his voice low but urgent. Whatever he was saying, it didn't seem to be working. The driver's expression remained blank, as though he wasn't hearing a word. Then, out of nowhere, the tall man in the back of the bus stood up too, making his way toward the front. The passengers froze, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. The black man, still seated, watched intently, sensing that everything was about to come to a head. The tall man reached the front of the bus, just as the man in the suit turned around to face him. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silence. The passengers watched, holding their breath, not knowing what to expect. "You should listened when you had the chance," the tall man said, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't outrun your past forever." The man in the suit squared his shoulders, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not trying to outrun anything," he said. "But whatever you think this is, you're wrong." Before anyone could react, the black man stood up from his seat and made his way down the aisle, positioning himself between the two men. His presence was quiet but commanding, and it forced both men to pause. The passengers watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the sudden shift. "You've been chasing the wrong person," the black man said calmly, his eyes locked on the tall man. "This isn't about him. It's about you." The tall man's face twisted in confusion, his bravado faltering. "What are you talking about?" The black man took a step closer, his voice steady. "You've been looking for someone to blame, someone to take your anger out on. But the truth is, you're the one running from yourself." The tall man blinked, clearly caught off guard. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. The tension in the bus shifted, as if everyone could sense that the dynamic had changed. The man in the suit, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hung in the air. "This goes deeper than you think." But before anyone could respond, the bus suddenly lurched to a stop. The passengers were thrown forward as the doors hissed open. Outside, the street was eerily empty, the city sounds muted in the distance. Without warning, two men in dark suits boarded the bus, their expressions cold and unreadable. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the crowd before zeroing in on the man in the suit. "It's time to go," one of them said, his voice devoid of emotion. The man in the suit didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face calm but resigned. As he made his way toward the door, the passengers watched in stunned silence. None of them knew who these men were or why they were taking him, but it was clear that this wasn't an ordinary situation. As the man in the suit reached the door, he turned to the black man, who had remained silent during the exchange. There was a moment of understanding between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Then, without another word, the man in the suit stepped off the bus, disappearing into the night, with the two men in dark suits. The doors closed, and the bus started moving again, the tension slowly dissipating, but leaving a lingering sense of unease. The passengers were left with more questions than answers. Who was the man in the suit? Why had those men come for him? And what did the black man know that the rest of them didn't? As the bus turned back onto its original route, the black man returned to his seat, his face calm but thoughtful. The tall man remained standing at the front, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Just as the bus approached the next stop, the black man stood up again. He made his way toward the front, pausing briefly beside the tall man. "Sometimes, the answers you're looking for aren't as far away as you think," he said quietly, before stepping off the bus. The tall man watched him go, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. He didn't follow, but it was clear that something had shifted in him, something he couldn't quite put into words. The bus continued on its route, the passengers slowly relaxing as the city lights blurred by. But even as the tension faded, the mystery of what had just happened lingered in the air. The passengers may never know the full story, but they had all been witnesses to something much bigger than they realized. And as the bus rumbled toward its final destination, the black man disappeared into the night, leaving behind more questions than answers. But for those who had been on that bus, they would never forget the day when everything changed, and they realized that the people around them were far more complicated and connected than they had ever imagined. As the bus continued down the road, the tension that had gripped the passengers began to ease. People slowly returned to their seats, glancing at each other as if trying to piece together what had just happened. The events of the night felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But this wasn't fiction, it had been real, and it had left everyone on the bus changed in some way. The tall man remained standing at the front of the bus, staring out the window. He hadn't moved since the black man got off. His mind was spinning, replaying the words that had been said. He'd been so sure of his anger, so convinced that he was the one in control. But now, everything felt different. There was something about the black man's calm, his quiet strength, that had unsettled him. It wasn't just about what had happened on the bus, it was something deeper, something that had been festering inside him for a long time. He had spent so much of his life blaming others, holding on to resentment, and now it felt like that anger was slipping away, leaving behind an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. As the bus approached the next stop, the tall man finally moved. He glanced at the other passengers, who were still watching him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, and then he quietly exited the bus. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the cool night air. The city buzzed around him, the noise of traffic and distant conversations filling the space where his thoughts used to be. He had no idea what to do next. He didn't know where to go, or what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't stay the same. Meanwhile, inside the bus, the passengers began to talk amongst themselves, sharing their thoughts on what had just transpired. The older woman who had been sitting near the front shook her head, still in disbelief. "You never really know what people are going through, do you?" she said softly to the person next to her. "We all carry our own burdens, but sometimes it takes a moment like this to really see it." Others nodded in agreement, reflecting on how quickly things had escalated, and how one stranger had managed to defuse the situation with nothing more than a few well-placed words. It was a reminder that, in the midst of chaos, there was always the possibility of understanding, of finding common ground, even if it came from the most unexpected places. As the bus continued on, the driver remained silent, focused on the road ahead. He hadn't spoken much during the whole ordeal, but now that the tension had passed, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier. He had seen a lot over the years: fights, arguments, confrontations, but something about tonight had been different. It wasn't just the drama, it was the way it had ended. The way that one man, without raising his voice or making a scene, had managed to change the entire tone of the night. The bus eventually arrived at its final stop, and the remaining passengers filed off, their steps slower, more thoughtful than when they had boarded. Each of them left with something to think about, some small change in perspective that they hadn't expected when they'd started their journey. The night had taken them all somewhere they hadn't anticipated, and it was clear that none of them would forget it anytime soon. For the black man who had been at the center of it all, the night had also left its mark. As he walked through the quiet streets, his mind replayed the events over and over. He had been through situations like that before, had faced hostility and racism more times than he could count. But tonight had felt different, not because of what was said to him, but because of how he had responded. There had been a time when he might have reacted with anger, when he would have let the insults get under his skin. But tonight, he had chosen a different path, and it had made all the difference. As he turned the corner and headed toward home, he couldn't help but think about the tall man. He wondered what was going through his mind now, whether he was reflecting on what had happened, or if he had already moved on. It was hard to say. People like him, the ones who carried so much anger and resentment, often didn't change overnight. But the black man hoped, in his own way, that maybe tonight had been a turning point. Maybe, just maybe, something had shifted inside the tall man, something that would lead him to question his assumptions, to rethink the way he saw the world. The black man knew that change didn't happen quickly, and it didn't come easily. But he also knew that every small moment mattered. Every time someone chose compassion over anger, empathy over hatred, it made a difference. Maybe not a big one, maybe not right away, but those moments added up over time. They had to. When he finally reached his front door, he paused for a moment, taking in the stillness of the night. He thought about the journey he had just been on, not just the physical one, but the emotional one as well. It wasn't easy, living in a world where you constantly had to prove your worth, where you had to fight for your humanity. But tonight had reminded him that he wasn't alone in that fight. There were others, people like him, who understood what it was like to be on the receiving end of ignorance and hatred. And there were also people who, when given the chance, could surprise you with their capacity for change. As he stepped inside, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The night had been full of tension and uncertainty, but in the end, it had also been full of possibility. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that tonight, something important had happened. Not just for him, but for everyone on that bus. And as he sat down to rest, the weight of the day finally lifting from his shoulders, he realized that this was the real victory, the knowledge that, in the face of hatred, he had chosen understanding. In the face of ignorance, he had chosen patience. And in the face of anger, he had chosen to stay calm and true to himself. That, more than anything, was what mattered. The next morning, life went on as usual. The sun rose, the streets filled with people going about their daily routines, and the world kept turning. But for those who had been on the bus that night, there was a lingering sense of change in the air. They carried the memory of what had happened with them, quietly reflecting on the lessons they had learned. The tall man, now walking through the bustling city streets, found himself thinking about the black man, more often than he expected. He didn't know why, but something about that night had stuck with him. Maybe it was the way the man had handled himself with such grace and dignity. Or maybe it was the way his own anger had started to feel hollow and pointless. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to make some changes in his own life. He wasn't sure where to start, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ready to try. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, life went on. The world was still far from perfect, still full of challenges and conflicts. But for the people who had shared that bus ride, there was a quiet understanding that had taken root. They had seen the power of compassion, the strength of choosing peace over conflict, and the impact that one person could have on those around them. In the end, it wasn't about the insults or the confrontation. It was about the choices that were made afterward, the choice to reflect, to grow, and to become better, even when it wasn't easy. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson all along.